Boston, June 1775. The smoke of Lexington and Concord still clings to the air, and the gunpowder smell of rebellion lingers in the streets. For 2 long months the city has been a cage. Inside, more than 5,000 British regulars, the pride of the King's army, hold Boston under martial law. Outside, in a tightening noose, more than 15,000 colonial militiamen, farmers, tradesmen and blacksmiths, dig trenches and sharpen bayonets, watching, waiting. The city is starving. Loyalist families cling to the protection of British muskets, while patriot sympathizers slip messages through shadowed alleys. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America, cannot remain bottled up forever. He knows if the Americans seize the high ground surrounding Boston, the Royal Navy's ships in the harbor and the entire city itself would be under constant threat. The colonists know it too. Their leaders, men like Artemas Ward and Israel Putnam, whisper the same idea in war councils. Take the hills, force the Empire's hand. On the night of June 16th, with moonlight shimmering across the harbor, a column of men moved silently toward the Charlestown Peninsula. They carried picks and shovels instead of muskets. Their orders were clear: fortify the heights before dawn. Not Bunker Hill, as originally planned, but the lower rise called Breed's Hill, there overlooking both Boston and the harbor they dug. By morning, a crude earthen wall rose from the ground, a direct challenge to British power. When the sun lifted over the Atlantic, British officers stared in disbelief. Rebel fortifications stood bold and defiant less than a mile from their lines. The stage was set. The Empire would not ignore this insult, and the world would soon witness one of the bloodiest, most iconic battles of the American Revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In the spring of 1775, Boston was no longer a thriving colonial port. It was a city under siege. The battles at Lexington and Concord had electrified the countryside, drawing thousands of militiamen from across New England. Farmers left their plows in the fields. Blacksmiths dropped their hammers mid-strike. From Connecticut to New Hampshire, men poured into the makeshift camps that began to ring the city. By May, Boston had become an island fortress. The Royal Navy's warships patrolled the harbor like watchful sentinels, their black hulls bristling. With cannons inside the city, more than 5,000 British soldiers, disciplined red-coated veterans of empire, patrolled cobbled streets and confiscated supplies from residents. The city's loyalists clung to their authority, while patriot families faced hunger and suspicion. Beyond Boston's boundaries, in Cambridge, Roxbury and the farmlands of Charlestown, a very different army was taking shape. It was not the army of a nation, for no nation yet existed. It was a patchwork of colonial militias answering to their towns, their captains, and their local committees. Their discipline was uneven. Their supplies were scarce. Many carried old muskets inherited from fathers or fowling pieces used for hunting. Some had no bayonets at all. Yet what they lacked in polish they made up for in determination. At their head stood General Artemas Ward, a stern but cautious leader supported by fiery figures such as Israel Putnam of Connecticut, a man more comfortable on horseback with a musket than behind a desk with quill and ink. Together they faced a monumental problem: how to bottle up one of the most powerful armies on earth without being crushed. The answer lay in the landscape. Boston was surrounded by a series of hills and peninsulas. Whoever controlled these heights controlled the city itself. Dorchester Heights to the south, Charlestown to the north. Across the harbor, the British could see these ridges every morning, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Inside Boston, General Thomas Gage, the British commander, knew this too. He had watched the colonial forces grow bolder each day, cutting off supply routes, intercepting loyalist messages, and constructing crude earthworks. He knew the rebels were not simply farmers with pitchforks. They were beginning to think like soldiers. The tension was unbearable. Boston's residents whispered rumors of invasion or starvation. Militiamen, meanwhile, grew restless in their encampments. Every night, campfires flickered across the hills surrounding the city, glowing like a chain of defiance. By June, the question was no longer if the British would try to break out of Boston, but when, and for the colonial commanders the question was equally pressing: should they strike first? The decision would come to a head not in the council chambers of Boston, but in a secretive meeting in Cambridge. There, in the dim light of candles, the colonial leadership debated a daring plan. If the rebels could seize and fortify the high ground on Charlestown Peninsula overlooking Boston and the harbor, they could threaten the very lifeline of the British Army. It was a gamble, a provocation so bold it would force the Empire to respond with overwhelming force. But to men like Putnam it was worth the risk. And so, with shovels and picks instead of muskets, the colonists prepared to strike. The night of June 16, 1775, would see more than 1,000 men march silently toward the Charlestown Peninsula. Their mission to build a fortress in the dark, their target a hill that would soon become immortal. On the evening of June 16, 1775, the air over Boston Harbor was heavy with summer heat and tension. The city's streets lay hushed beneath the watchful eyes of British sentries, while across the water in Cambridge the colonial camp stirred with quiet determination. A secret order had gone out tonight. The rebels would seize the high ground. Under the command of Colonel William Prescott, nearly 1,200 men were assembled, a mixture of Massachusetts and Connecticut militia, joined by a few artillerymen. They carried no banners, no drums, and spoke little as they marched. Instead of muskets at the ready, most carried shovels, pickaxes, and spades. For tonight their weapons were not steel and lead, but wood and earth. Their destination was the Charlestown Peninsula, a narrow strip of land just across the river from Boston. From there rose two hills, Bunker Hill and the smaller Breed's Hill. The plan, at least on paper, was to fortify Bunker Hill, the higher of the two. But as Prescott's column advanced, under the cloak of night, guided by whispers and starlight, he made a fateful choice. Breed's Hill, though lower, lay closer to Boston, and would allow their guns to threaten both the city and the British fleet in the harbor. And so by lantern light the men set to work. Shovels bit into the hard New England soil, thudding rhythmically in the darkness. The sound of iron striking rock carried faintly across the water, but the British sentries posted on warships like the Lively mistook it for routine. As the night wore on, the outline of an earthen redoubt began to take shape atop Breed's Hill. The men worked with feverish energy, sweat mingling with dirt as they piled earth into breastworks nearly 6 feet high. Some cursed quietly at the labor, others muttered prayers. Still others stole glances toward Boston, where lanterns flickered faintly in the distance, wondering if they would live to see another dawn. By morning the colonists had accomplished the impossible in less than 12 hours. A formidable fortification stood on Breed's Hill. Earthen walls, trenches, and hastily built fences, reinforced with hay bales, marked a position of astonishing defiance. When the first rays of sunlight spilled across the harbor, the British awoke to a stunning sight. Where the evening before there had been open fields, now a fortress bristled atop the Charlestown Peninsula. Soldiers in Boston rubbed their eyes in disbelief. Officers scrambled for their telescopes. One British general, upon seeing the works, reportedly exclaimed, "The rebels have done more in one night than my whole army could have done in a month." Panic spread through the city. If the colonists could place cannon atop these heights, the British fleet, anchored in the harbor, would be helpless. Boston itself, with its thousands of troops and loyalist citizens, would be trapped. General Thomas Gage had no choice. Orders were issued swiftly. The rebel position must be destroyed, and at once. Meanwhile, on Breed's Hill, Colonel Prescott surveyed the fortifications with grim satisfaction. His men were tired, hungry, and ill-equipped, but they had done what no one thought possible. They had placed the fate of Boston, and perhaps the entire revolution, into the balance of a single hill. The die was cast. The morning of June 17th would bring with it not just the sun, but the thunder of cannon fire, the tramp of British regiments, and the roar of a battle that would shake the colonies to their core. Dawn on June 17, 1775, broke with an uneasy stillness over Boston Harbor. The redoubt on Breed's Hill loomed defiantly across the water, its earthen walls freshly dug and bristling with armed colonists within. Boston, the sight was intolerable. A scar on British pride and a direct challenge to imperial control. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America, convened his officers at once. With him were three of Britain's most formidable generals, Sir William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. Each recognized the danger. If cannon were mounted on Breed's Hill, Boston and its fleet would be untenable. The rebels had to be dislodged immediately, no matter the cost. By mid-morning, plans were drawn. General Howe would lead an assault directly against the Colonial position. Over 2200, British troops would cross the Charles River in longboats, land at the base of the Charlestown Peninsula, and march steadily up the slope of Breed's Hill. It would be a classic display of British discipline, bright red coats, gleaming bayonets, and tight formations sweeping aside the ragged colonial militia. On the rebel side, the scene was far different. Colonel William Prescott's men, scarcely 1,200, were exhausted from their night's labor. Many had little food, almost no water, and a dangerously short supply of ammunition. They watched from the ramparts as the British began to move, their red coats flashing like blood against the green fields. The harbor came alive with motion. British warships trained their cannons on the peninsula, unleashing booming salvos that shook the ground and sent plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. Charlestown itself, lying just below the rebel position, was deliberately set ablaze by British artillery. Within minutes, flames consumed rooftops and thick, black smoke curled into the sky, a grim curtain rising on the day's slaughter. From the rebel redoubt, the colonists looked on in stunned silence. Some clenched their muskets tighter, others whispered prayers, but all could see what was coming. Rank upon rank of redcoats forming at the base of the hill, their drums beating a steady cadence of death. General Howe's strategy was simple but brutal. The British would march in tight lines, shoulder to shoulder up the slope. Once in range, they would deliver volleys of musket fire and finish the rebels with a bayonet charge. To him, this was no battle but a demonstration, a chance to show the colonists that defiance against the crown meant annihilation. Yet from the redoubt, Prescott remained calm. He walked the earthen walls, encouraging his men. With flinty resolve, he issued one of the most famous orders of the Revolution. Words remembered, even if their exact phrasing is debated: "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The meaning was clear: ammunition was too precious to waste on long shots. Every musket ball had to count. The men would hold their fire until the British were almost upon them, so close that their shots would tear through the dense red lines with devastating effect. As the sun climbed higher, the spectacle reached its peak. Thousands of British soldiers, immaculate in dress and deadly in purpose, began their advance up Breed's Hill. Their bayonets caught the light, gleaming like rows of steel teeth. The air trembled with the sound of drums' commands and the crunch of synchronized boots. Inside the redoubt, hearts pounded. Some men swallowed hard. Others fixed their eyes on the approaching wall of red. Still no shot rang out. They waited, muskets steady, knuckles white. The stage was set. In moments, the bloody heart of the Battle of Bunker Hill would erupt. The British drums thundered as if summoning fate itself. Columns of redcoats, bayonets fixed, began their ascent of Breed's Hill. The soldiers advanced in precise ranks, a wall of scarlet and steel, climbing slowly, methodically toward the rebel fortifications. It was the might of empire embodied. Professional soldiers trained to perfection, their very presence meant to intimidate. From behind the earthworks, the colonists waited. They crouched low, muskets gripped tight, the barrels steady on the dirt. Ramparts. Their stomachs churned as the red line drew closer. But Colonel William Prescott paced calmly among them, his voice cutting through the rising din. "Steady, men, steady. Do not waste your powder, wait for them, wait." Every heartbeat felt like a lifetime. the British closed in their bright coats, vivid against the smoke and flames rising from the burning town of Charlestown. Below, the colonists could hear their officers barking orders, the rhythmic tramp of boots, the metallic rattle of bayonets in unison. Still no shots fired. At last, when the British were so close that the whites of their eyes glimmered beneath their tricorn hats, Prescott's order came sharp and final, "Now fire." The redoubt erupted in a thunderous volley. Hundreds of muskets discharged at once, flames and smoke bursting from the earthworks like the very mouth of hell. The front ranks of British soldiers were torn apart. Men staggered, collapsed, or fell backward onto their comrades. The precision of empire was shattered in an instant, replaced with screams and chaos. The colonists reloaded frantically, hands trembling but practiced. Powder shot ramrod aim. Another volley cracked through the air. Again the British lines buckled. Officers shouted, trying to rally their men. But the narrow slope of Breed's Hill became a killing ground. Redcoats stumbled over bodies, some slipping in blood-soaked grass. Yet trained as they were, the British pressed forward. Their discipline drove them onward, though each step brought fresh casualties. They fired volleys of their own musket smoke, clouding the field. But the colonists held the advantage of cover. From behind their rough walls they poured shot after shot into the advancing lines. At last the first assault faltered. The red ranks, shredded and bloodied, staggered back down the hill. Officers waved their swords, furiously urging their men to reform. But the colonists erupted in cheers. Against all odds, the farmers and tradesmen of New England had repelled the king's finest soldiers. But there was no time to revel in victory. Down below, General Howe rallied his men for another attempt. Furious, humiliated, determined, he would not allow a militia to hold the hill. Within the redoubt, ammunition was already running low. Some colonists had fired fewer than a dozen rounds, but each shot was precious. Men checked their powder horns with grim faces. There would be no resupply. And yet, when the British lines reformed at the base of the hill, the colonists readied themselves again. Exhausted, dry-throated, arms heavy but still unbroken, the British drums rolled once more. The red line began to climb again. The hill was about to run red with even more blood. The lull between assaults was brief. Too brief. Down at the base of Breed's Hill, General William Howe and his surviving officers rallied the British regiments. The field was littered with bodies, but the British Empire had not built its reputation on retreat. Howe barked orders, his sword flashing in the smoke, determined to break the rebel lines with sheer persistence if not fear. From the rebel earthworks above, the colonists peered down in grim silence. The sight was both terrifying and surreal. The British were forming again, tight ranks of scarlet coats, bayonets glinting even through the haze. It was as if death itself refused to yield, marching back up the hill with renewed fury. Colonel Prescott's voice steadied the shaken militia. "Stand firm, men, make every shot count. Powder is precious. Do not fire until you see them close." The words repeated like a heartbeat through the lines, giving the men something to cling to. Then the drums began again. The second assault surged forward with grim determination. The British ranks climbed the slope, stepping over their own dead. Officers shouted commands, urging the men to quicken their pace. This time they were not marching at the same measured tempo. They were coming with anger, intent on crushing the colonists who had dared humiliate the king's army. At Prescott's signal, another thunderous volley burst from the earthworks. The front line of redcoats collapsed once more, torn down by the disciplined fire. Smoke, billowed musket balls whistled through the air, and the hillside echoed with the screams of the wounded. Volley after volley was exchanged. The colonists crouched low behind their defenses, while the redcoats pressed relentlessly forward. Cannons from the ships below pounded the hill, shaking the very ground. Still the red line climbed. In the chaos, the colonists' supply of powder grew dangerously thin. Some men had only a handful of rounds left. Others tore wadding from their shirts to stuff down barrels. A few fought with nothing but stones, ready to hurl them if needed. But morale held. When the British reached within a dozen yards of the earthworks, the colonists unleashed another devastating volley. Entire sections of the British front rank disintegrated. Survivors tripped over bodies and stumbled backward. Once again, the assault buckled under the withering fire. For the second time, the mighty British army reeled down the slope, leaving behind a trail of corpses. The hillside was a charnel ground. From within the redoubt, the rebels erupted in exhausted cheers. They had repelled not one, but two full assaults by the most powerful army in the world. Hope surged even as the smoke stung their eyes and their powder horns grew empty. But Howe was not finished. The drums began to roll again. The bloodiest moment was still to come. The battlefield was a vision of hell's smoke rolled in choking waves across the slopes of Breed's Hill. The cries of the wounded mingled with the sharp reports of muskets and the distant thud of British naval cannon. The ground was slick with blood. And yet, amid the carnage, Howe ordered a third assault. This time there would be no faltering. Reinforcements pushed forward, their scarlet coats darkened with sweat and smoke. Howe's plan was brutal: strike directly at the redoubt, overwhelm it with cold steel, and crush the rebellion in one terrible blow. Inside the colonial lines, the mood was grim. Ammunition was nearly gone. Some soldiers counted their last few musket balls, knowing that once spent only bayonets, knives, and rocks would remain. Prescott walked the line, his face blackened with smoke. "Hold fast, lads. Give them your all. When the powder's gone, use your bayonets. Use your fists if you must. This hill shall not fall easily." The third assault was different. The British advanced more deliberately, but with terrifying resolve. Bayonets glistened as the ranks closed tight. The rebels waited until the red line was at the base of the earthworks. Then in one final volley they unleashed their fire. Muskets roared, and once again redcoats fell in heaps. But this time the colonists had nothing left. The clash was brutal. The British surged over the walls, bayonets stabbing into packed ranks of militiamen. The redoubt erupted into chaos, men grappling, screaming, fighting at arm's length. Joseph Warren, the beloved patriot leader who had volunteered as a common soldier that day, was struck down, becoming a martyr of the revolution. Prescott himself fought fiercely with his sword until his men were forced back. The militia retreated in small groups. Many escaped, but others fell beneath British steel. When the smoke cleared, the Union Jack stood over Breed's Hill. The British had their victory, but at an unimaginable cost. Over 1,000 of their 2,400 men were killed or wounded. The colonists lost around 400. A British officer later confessed, "A few more such victories would have ruined us." The colonists had been driven from the hill, but their spirit remained unbroken. What the British had hoped would be a crushing show of power became instead a rallying cry. Were littered with bodies, red coats and brown homespun alike. A stillness fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The British had won the hill, but few celebrated. Howe had taken the ground at the cost of nearly half his men. Of the 2,400 who had charged, more than 1,000 were dead or wounded. Officers especially had been cut down, leading their men into withering fire. For the colonists, the loss of Joseph Warren sent shockwaves, but also sanctified the battle. He became a martyr, proof that liberty demanded sacrifice. Prescott and his survivors withdrew in good order. Many would fight again. Though they had lost the ground, they had won something greater: confidence. News raced across the colonies. Farmers and tradesmen had stood toe-to-toe with the world's finest army and nearly destroyed them. Washington, hearing the story, declared, "The liberties of our country are safe." In Britain, the shock was profound. Newspapers reported staggering losses. The government had expected rebellion to collapse, but Bunker Hill told a different story. The Americans were determined, resourceful, and deadly. Though technically a defeat, Bunker Hill was remembered as a triumph of courage. It inspired thousands to take up arms. It convinced both sides the war would be long, bitter, and costly. The revolution had found its first great story of blood and defiance, and the name of Bunker Hill would never be forgotten. The Battle of Bunker Hill remains one of the great paradoxes of the revolution. Technically a British victory, it was celebrated by colonists as proof they could stand against the most disciplined army in the world. It revealed the price Britain would pay to subdue a people determined to be free. The blood spilled on Breed's Hill carried a message across the Atlantic. This was no minor riot. The colonies had teeth, they had courage, they would not be cowed. For America, the battle became legend. Told in taverns, churches, and town squares retold, until it became a story of shared sacrifice. Bunker Hill foreshadowed the long bitter war to come. A war where victories and defeats would blur, where courage mattered as much as cannons, where endurance would decide freedom. Years later, veterans carried the memory of that fiery June day, of smoke drifting over Boston Harbor, of cannon thunder rolling across the peninsula, of muskets raised until the whites of the enemy's eyes gleamed in sight. The hill was lost. The revolution was found.